Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. This is the show where we explore how leaders build capabilities that they need for future work. What if the best place to design your next global breakthrough is not Silicon Valley, but somewhere where money, infrastructure, and resources are scarce? We tend to think of great innovation coming from having more capital, more technology, more talent, more room to experiment. But some of the most powerful innovations begin with exactly the opposite. Constraints that force us to rethink what a product truly needs to do and how we can deliver it at dramatically less cost but more value. Today, we're exploring why emerging markets may be one of the most important places for your next breakthrough. My guest today is Amos Winter, an MIT professor and co-author of the latest best-selling book with Dr. Vijay Govindarajan, Global by Design: How to Create Innovations at Scale, Travel, and Transform. His co-author, Vijay Govindarajan, writes a weekly LinkedIn column on innovation where he continues to explore these new ideas and developments related to the book. So I encourage you to follow him on LinkedIn if you want to keep up on his thinking. Now, their argument in this book challenges the way many companies approach global innovation. Instead of designing products for wealthy markets and then stripping them down for the rest of the world, they argue that companies should start in a resource-constrained environment where demands are tougher and trade-offs are sharper. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm Charles Good. This show is built for leaders, managers, and high achievers who want to think better, grow faster, and perform under pressure. Each episode, I sit down with leading researchers, best-selling authors, and experts to uncover what actually works, the practical tools, proven strategies, and insights you can use when the pressure is real. Because in a world that keeps changing, the edge belongs to those who can outlearn what worked yesterday, outthink what's coming next, and outperform when it counts. Welcome to the program, Amos. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Charles. Good to be here.
Well, let's start at the core. And with the title of your book, you say a product is global by design. Talk to us in terms of what you mean by that, because in some contexts, I would assume that means just a product that can be sold in multiple countries.
So the book title is actually a double entendre in that if you are diligent and thoughtful, you can create products that have global appeal. And we're all familiar with many, like Coca-Cola or iPhones. And they resonate with a core value that users like everywhere. And then the other part of the title is the phrase by design. And in the book, we're really trying to convey that diligent, thoughtful process that you can embark on to make those globally relevant products.
So in practice, that sounds like you're baking in global constraints into the design brief from day one, not trying to retrofit it later.
You can figure out what's going to appeal to users globally from day one. You can talk to them and get a sense of that. You can actually use emerging markets. So you alluded to this in your intro, starting with a resource constraint setting, which is going to help you drive value creation because you have to create a relatively high performance but low cost product for it to be adopted in a lower resource setting. But if you do that well, you can actually create a disruptive product that provides greater value than the current offerings in wealthy countries.
So what I hear is that global by design is more of a capability than a project. It's the ability to repeatedly design for multiple markets under constraint, which has huge implications for how we train engineers and leaders. Why do you think these markets are such powerful engines for innovation rather than just places to sell cheaper versions of existing products?
So the trying to sell cheaper versions of existing products is one of the strategies that companies have failed at many times because nobody wants crappy offerings, right? And so why resource constrained markets are drivers for innovation are manyfold, actually. The first is that's where all the economic action is in the world. So over the last 20 years, emerging markets have grown at a much greater rate, at times 4 times the rate of existing wealthier markets. And even right now, they're still growing at 2 times the rate. So if you want to expand your company into a new market that is growing quickly, you want to look at emerging markets. But another reason is that all the most compelling humanitarian problems facing the world are in poor countries. Problems around water and sanitation and energy and healthcare. And we just as a society should address those because those problems affect billions of people. But what makes it a great incubator for innovation is that when you look at those problems, you realize they've been solved in wealthy countries, or at least greatly diminished. Like we all in the US have, or most people have clean water, have sanitation, have energy. And so it's not a fact that there's a lack of solutions out there. It's that the solutions we have in wealthy markets don't map over to poor countries. And so if you can somehow understand what is different about the problems in poor countries, come up with a higher value solution that delivers adequate performance, but at a much lower price, then you can create something that's globally valuable, because you can take it back to wealthy markets and people can get the same value, the same performance at a lower price.
I love that. Thank you for unpacking that. Can you give me maybe an example of where solving an emerging market problem created something that actually outperformed the incumbents in a wealthy market?
Yeah. So, one of the real foundational examples in our book is about this motorcycle called the Honda Super Cub. And Honda started working on this motorcycle in the late 1950s. And at that time, Japan was very much a re-emerging market following World War II. And so it had rough roads, it had a lot of resource constraints. And they read the market right in that they realized they needed a delivery vehicle where the driver could have one hand free to hold goods they were delivering and just use the other hand to control the motorcycle. That's opposed to a normal motorcycle where you need both hands. They realized it needs big wheels to go on rough roads. It ideally has a lot more power for the engine size than motorcycles at the time, so you can go faster and climb hills faster, but they still used a small engine, so you don't need a license in most countries to use it. And they made it super, super cheap with just brilliant design about how the frame is made from stamped sheet metal rather than welded tubes. And the fairing that blocks the wind is a single component made of plastic that's injection molded. So they got all these requirements right to get it to sell well in Japan. But also, I think they probably had the foresight of how to make it a globally valuable product by some of these features as well. Because one, instead of making a motorcycle you had to straddle, they made it so you could step through the frame and you could sit with your knees together. That opened up a whole new group of consumers of women, right? Particularly in markets where it may not be appropriate or viewed as appropriate culturally for a woman to spread her legs on a motorcycle. They made it super, super reliable so people who weren't necessarily mechanically inclined could also work on it. But the most brilliant design of that motorcycle to really make it a global product was the ad campaign. Because they said, you meet the nicest people on a Honda. And they showed these pictures of the preppy college couple on the campus riding around and, showing the guy that you'd like your daughter to date. And that was very much in contrast with motorcycle riders at the time in wealthy markets. And those motorcyclists at the time were really characterized by Marlon Brando in the movie The Wild Ones, which are these like greasy, gritty guys getting in fights all the time. And Honda was just like, nope, that's not our image. And so they broadened this into a much, much bigger market of previously non-consumers. And it proliferated as a global product because it was aspirational, it was attractive, it was super dirt cheap. And they also made it everywhere in many countries so you could avoid tariffs and stuff, which also kept it cheap.
Love that example. Thank you for providing that. Well, zooming out to the macro picture, what business shifts now are making this framework especially relevant? So, kind of that why now question.
Well, I think the big one is the growth rate of emerging markets. But I think if you talk to most, particularly multinational companies, they realize that's where the action is. But even just realizing that doesn't mean you're ready to capture it. And so I interact with companies all the time that, certainly on face value, they recognize, oh, this would be great if we go to emerging markets. But really understanding those requirements that would have to be met to engage those markets successfully, that's a whole other challenge that many other companies don't know how to address. And so I think as companies are striving for greater growth, they see the opportunity but don't know how to do it. That makes this book timely because it gives guidance. But I think actually also, as far as a challenge at home here in the US, the affordability crisis is also driving the need to come up with high performance, low cost solutions. And actually, just today, we had an article come out in Fortune that talks about how existing strategies that have been used in the past to make more affordable products are probably tapped out. So one is the cost coefficient of products. There's a limit to how big a pallet of mayonnaise somebody wants to buy, right? You can't haul a big like tanker home of mayonnaise. Another is Walmartification, where Walmart can actually pressure suppliers to make lower market segment products that are still branded with their strong brand name. And so Levi's is like the greatest example. It's not the same quality as the regular Levi's that have been around for 100-something years. And so if you keep pushing down product quality, you end up with something like terrible that can actually hurt the brand and consumers don't want. And then a third is just over subsidization. So if we, let's say, attack the healthcare affordability crisis by just deferring tax money to pay to healthcare, we're still all paying those costs. It hasn't actually gotten cheaper. It's just deferring or just shifting who's paying it. So the premise of this op-ed is that maybe we want to look to emerging markets where a lot of companies have been successful by looking at these markets and looking at the problems with fresh eyes to realize it's actually a slightly different set of requirements that are demanded in order to create that high performance, low cost solution that can work in emerging markets. Maybe we can apply that same thinking to the US.
And like you mentioned in the book too, on one side, what you were alluding to and talking about is that technological advancement is accelerating, making it possible to create these sophisticated solutions at a lower marginal cost. But on the other hand, the rise of the global south is reshaping where demand and growth will come from in the coming decades. At that same time, climate change, resource scarcity, widening inequality, and wealthier markets as well means that designing under constraint is no longer a developing world issue. It's becoming a strategic reality for advanced economies as well. So that's something that I don't know how many leaders really understand or have that as a priority right now.
It's an ever-shifting landscape. You're absolutely right. And I'm going to add another curveball in all this. So I feel like we're living right now in this rise of AI time where I feel all the time society's looking at AI as like almost this savior that's going to be able to solve unbelievable problems, previously unsolvable problems. And I use AI constantly, right? It is dramatically changed how I can innovate because I can aggregate information so much faster than I could before. However, our book touches on a class of problems that are going to be out of the reach of AI for a long time. And the reason is threefold. The first is when I'm creating technologies in global markets, I'm having to integrate and aggregate information that's often not formally recorded, right? It's things about like culture and sentiment and how people allocate their money. And then also I have to mix with that very like uncompatible data sets of like physics and math. And that convergence and that aggregation, AI just can't do. And AI is not like out on the ground gathering that information, right? So it's not accessible to put into large language models. The second factor is that because I work on physical products, there's an element of physical touch that's still so important. Like, how does the soil feel on a farm? How wet is it? What does wood feel like as it slides or as it expands when it gets moisture in it? And like in any field of engineering, even the top levels of aerospace or Formula One, there's still a feel that matters a lot. And AI doesn't have that because it's not in the physical world, right? There's a limit to how much it can really understand. And then the final point is rapport building. I have to so often go to another country, sit in the kitchen and have tea with a person and just connect with them as two people. And we share life experiences about our kids or about how the weather's affecting us or about how our dad's a jerk. And like that type of stuff builds bonds and lets people share information and gives you insights as an innovator that you can't get otherwise. You can't see the world through other people's eyes without doing that connection. And AI is just not a participant in the physical world in that human experience, right? So because of all that, we still have to solve these wickedly hard challenges and go after these amazing opportunities in emerging markets. And It's a class of problems that AI can't do, but we're trying to give insights about how to go about doing that in our book.
Great insight there. And I also write a lot about AI, and I talk more about which I would love your thoughts on, the output capability gap, because the first time really in history, your output can keep improving and getting more and more polished while the capability underneath does not.
I see it very much as an educator. My bet is that it's going to settle on a place where you're augmenting your abilities with AI and the information and the ability to synthesize that information that AI gives you, but you're using it to actually enhance your inherent human processing capabilities. So we've seen this over the last 20 years with search engines, right? Knowledge that you have to keep in your head. Well, you can just kind of keep that out in the internet and just know that in your pocket, you have this little computer that you can just look something up. And I've seen this symbiosis in my own students, just in my last 15 years or so, this, and I don't even want to call it a reliance. I think actually symbiosis is the best way to put it, is that there's classes of information that it's really not worth to memorize.
You're right.
Right? Because you have it at hand. And I think that's going to happen similarly with AI. And I personally experience this constantly, in that if I want to say, understand the regulatory standards about like solar power or something in Morocco, right, that may not even be written in English, AI can consolidate that and give me a summary super fast, like way faster than I could learn it myself. That's great. Does it help me design a better solar powered irrigation system? I have to take in a bunch of other factors as a human. And so I think humans' sweet spot here is that we, for whatever reason, from an evolutionary perspective, like we've been able to create solutions with very little prior knowledge about that problem, or seeing other solutions similar to what we're going to create. So we don't need a lot of past data. So we don't work exactly like an LLM in a traditional sense. And then also what humans are really good at is deriving orthogonal inspiration to create new solutions. And an example I love to give of that is, imagine you took all Broadway shows pre-2016 or so and fed them into an LLM and said, make the next Broadway hit. There's no way it would have come up with Hamilton. Forget it. Hamilton's too orthogonal, right? It's about a founding father, which is like the most boring topic, on face value. And it has so much more 90s hip hop in it than a typical Broadway show would, right? So that's what people are great at.
You're right. A great example. And I see that as well, that AI is not bad. Some you want to offload to AI. You just want to keep those load bearing capabilities to yourself, human first, AI second, to challenge or have it as a sparring partner instead of outsourcing your thinking to it. So that's so critical. So in your book, you talk about 3 merits that determine whether a problem is worth tackling. Can you walk us through those and how they guide where you invest your next innovation effort into?
Certainly. Yeah. So we provide this 3 merits test because, we all watch the news and we see the challenges abroad, or we see opportunities in emerging market, but you have to down select like which ones are worth tackling. So this Venn diagram of the 3 merits is composed first of what we call problem merit. And what distilling problem merit is about is convincing yourself that you're going after a problem that, if solved, is going to have ideally a large, meaningful impact on a large number of people. So like if you're doing international development, you don't want to dig one pit latrine in one village and send a bunch of people on a plane to go across the world and do that. That's not very a scalable or high impact solution. Problem merit's also about trying to distill whether there's an unmet economic opportunity. Because if you see that, there's actually a business here or a business case here, then that gives you insights that there may be a naturally scalable solution if you can tap into that business case. And then the final part of problem merit is understanding that problem beyond a superficial level. So instead of saying people need clean water, you need to understand, what are the contaminants making the water dirty? How much water do people need? What is their willingness to pay for that water? So when you start innovating, you don't just blindly create a hammer and then go looking for nails. You actually describe all the nails first so you can design the best hammer. So then the next lobe of this 3-merit test in this Venn diagram is what we call innovation merit. And that is a gut check on whether or not innovation's actually required to solve this problem. You may be lucky enough to say, you know what? We can change a few features on an existing product and it will be good enough. It can actually meet all those requirements. Boom, done, easy. Or you may find like, hey, Bill Gates could maybe give enough money to actually solve malaria. Maybe we don't need a better mousetrap. But often in the type of problems I look at, from understanding the problem merit, I realize the problem I'm looking at is actually different than the similar looking problem that was solved in the US. And so I actually have to innovate a new solution. And the position I'm in all the time is I have to somehow provide similar performance as what you get in the US for anywhere from half to a tenth the price. And there's no obvious way to do that. And so I know I need to innovate. And I want to take a second to comment about these two lobes of this Venn diagram. I see most global innovation projects go wrong because those two lobes are not overlapping. Because you have people like, say, international aid agencies that have really deep boots on the ground insights into problems, but they're not necessarily well versed in the technical space. And that makes them very susceptible to snake oil salesmen. I help companies all the time too see these like wonderful shiny things like, oh, here's the silver bullet to my problem. And you go into the math and physics and you realize, no, it's not. It's snake oil. So that's one issue. The other issue is on the other side where you have tremendous technical capabilities, but no real understanding of the problems. And I see this both in innovation in companies and also in academia, in that people want to jump to creating that new mousetrap without knowing yet, is it going to be better? So you end up just making this hammer and then you go looking for nails. And that's often a recipe for failure. Another analogy I make often is it's playing darts blindfolded. Sure, you can throw a lot of darts and maybe you'll hit a lot of bullseyes, but if you take a little time to aim, you're much better off and much more likely to succeed. So then the last lobe of this Venn diagram is what we call value merit. And what that's about is aligning value propositions. And there's many that you have to align. So the first is within your own organization or within the funder that's going to support your work, you have to align with their value propositions. And it's the classic sales thing that like, you're not selling what you want, you're selling what they want, right? So you have to get support for your project. And then you also have to look out into the market and understand, why would somebody adopt your solution? What are their incentives? Are they going to improve their life? Ideally, are they going to make money off this thing? And then you have to look at who's incentivized to produce and disseminate your solution. So ideally, they're going to make money on selling whatever you create. And if you can tap into those free market mechanisms, you get natural sustaining and scaling because a company is incentivized to make money. So if you can figure out those value propositions for not only end users, but other key stakeholders like producers and distributors and governments that may be subsidizing, then you put yourself in the best position for success. And at the center of that Venn diagram, we show that the overlap region of all three of those lobes, if you're in that sweet spot, you probably have a reverse innovation opportunity because you can probably create something of higher value than the existing offerings in the US and Europe. And that value can make it sustain and scale in emerging markets, but also then go disrupt wealthy markets.
So for many organizations, this could become a discipline of saying no to attractive but misaligned projects, which is often harder than saying yes.
It very much is, because I find all the time people want to try something. It doesn't feel like you're solving the problem unless you're designing a solution. And so often I have to back up companies and be like, okay, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? And what does success even look like? And when you can define that, and by the way, you can do a lot of this before you design anything. You can go talk to stakeholders. You can do economic models. And then that really helps you down select to avoid those bad solution paths and really target in on what the good ones are.
Well, let's stay with the design decisions and talk about what actually matters most when you're creating global products. Because out of all the variables you discussed, cost, reliability, performance, culture fit, what do you see as a single most important design factor in creating global products and why?
This is such a great question, Charles. And I like that you use the word single, because there's not a single, but people want a single, right? Because it's easier to
Absolutely.
focus on a single, right? And we talk about this in the book, in that so much innovation is driven by what we call primary requirements, like making that new widget smaller or lighter or more efficient. But in reality, when you get into the real market, there's a lot of secondary requirements that are just as important, like price, consumer preference, robustness, repairability, supply chain. So there isn't ever a single thing that somebody should think about as far as requirements, but there is a single thing I think you can think about as an innovator to equip yourself for success. And that is actively broadening your perspective. So I say in every class I teach, and I talk about in the book as well, the single most powerful tool a designer has is perspective. And what I mean by that is that if you can actively try to see the world through the eyes of many stakeholders of the product or technology you're trying to create, you're more likely to understand the requirements that have to be satisfied for success. And if you understand the requirements, you're much more likely to satisfy them, right? It puts you in a necessity is the mother of invention situation. And why this is so important is that products only fail when requirements are not satisfied, when the thing is not cheap enough, is not useful enough, is not pretty enough. So the one thing, if we can impart one lesson from this book on people, is that you should actively try to broaden your perspective. And what that means in practice is, like, in your own organization, realize that everybody who works there has a perspective. If you run like Amazon, it's not just executives with the good ideas. Go talk to the forklift drivers. They know how the warehouse works and the inefficiencies and stuff like that. Use their perspective. And when you're designing global products, it's also so important to, like, go into the field and, like, literally interact with the people and hear their constraints and requirements and desires in their own life. This is another factor that makes designing global products so hard, because since the Industrial Revolution, basically the last 200 plus years, most product design has been focused on wealthy markets. And so it's us designing for us if you're from those markets. So if I all of a sudden have to think about, how do I design a solution for a mother of 5 in Kenya? I don't know her life. I'm completely, ignorant about that. So what's the way to overcome that ignorance? Try to get the information firsthand. So if you can map out that chain of stakeholders that is going to determine success or failure of the product, and by the way, if you break that chain anywhere, you're probably going to fail. Map that chain out and go talk to those people and try to get their perspective. And another really important facet of doing this exercise is recognizing your own ignorance. So we have an important principle in the book, which is called being a tempered dreamer. It's wonderful to be a dreamer. Like, don't constrain your creativity, but recognize everybody has constraints in resources or knowledge, or time. And so as you interact with your stakeholders, you realize everybody does have their own ignorance. Everybody has their own assumptions. So it creates an active process where you realize, okay, I have skills to bring to the table. For somebody like me, I'm good at engineering and, like, math and physics and stuff. But then I have a bunch of blind spots. So it makes you actively realize, oh, I shouldn't assume what that mother of 5 in Kenya wants. I should go talk to her.
Great insight there with getting those perspectives. I see this a lot too, where products are designed with the ideal performance, what it looks like in the lab. But when that level of performance is actually necessary and sufficient for use case, there's a disconnect. So because they're not diagnosing the eye condition in a rural clinic, or the irrigating fields under variable power, or purifying water with intermittent maintenance, they just haven't thought of those constraints, aren't getting those perspectives from those individuals. So the performance, what they think is ideal in the lab, is not connecting to the realities of what they're trying to find that solution for.
You're right. And for somebody in my position, I go through life, I think, often sad and frustrated when I see brilliance around me, people who are using their really deep subject matter insights to come up with brilliant novel solutions that I'll spot will never see the light of day because of these secondary requirements, because the solution's too big or too expensive. And we're just not trained as a culture of thinking more comprehensively about those requirements. We tend to create a solution and then go try to find a problem in a lot of ways. And I'm very much, to contrast this, I personally, I classify myself as a demand pull innovator. I'm not a tech push innovator. And it's actually very uncomfortable for me if I feel like I'm trying to create something, but I don't really know the problem. And my program at MIT, it's called the K. Lisa Yang Global Engineering and Research Center, and it goes by GEAR Center, the acronym. We go to tremendous lengths to understand the problem, to do that 3 merits test I talked about before we embark on a solution. And this can often take years of people in the field really distilling not only the requirements driven by the market, but what's also possible in terms of the math and physics and scaling arguments, or potentially modifying the existing art and technology in the space. And so what I'd say a hallmark of our program is what we call techno-economic forecasts. And that word forecast is very important because we do techno-economic analyses, very similar to people familiar with that term. And so we go into a market and kind of say, here's the lay of the land, here's how it is. But what we do that's a bit different is we do some forecasting in terms of what is possible given the math is physics. What is possible given maybe this new business model? What is possible if we use some existing technology, but in a different way or operate it differently? And so we do this forecast of where should our innovation direction be, and what is that North Star we should march towards, that we're very confident, given the economic and physics and mathematical justification, is tractable and that we can actually achieve. So we do these, we call them TEFs, techno-economic forecasts. We do those all the time first and then go innovate.
So the endorsements of Global by Design is a way to tackle wicked problems, poverty, climate, while still capturing trillion-dollar opportunities. So the question that I would have for you, because I know that would come up with leaders that I talk to, is then how should leaders think about the balance between commercial opportunity and humanitarian impact in this framework?
Well, it's always going to come down to the bottom line. If you're talking about business leaders, and we're not talking about like humanitarian organizations, we're talking about business leaders here, you have to make money. And I think you can then, through that lens, you can look at resource constrained markets and understand where there's certainly gaps in people's needs and desires, and then see, is there a product we can offer that people want to buy because they derive value from it, and that we can also make money from? So one of the really good examples of this in the book is GE's ultrasound machines that they really pioneered in like China and India about 20 years ago. So the story there is they were making these like $100,000 ultrasound machines that you'd find in hospitals in the US and Europe. And they originally tried to just sell them directly in China, and nobody bought them because they were too expensive. And so again, this is, like I was talking about before, this is a situation where you have to create higher value, relatively higher performance for the cost than their current US offerings. And so because they understood that, they were able to create a new class of machines that could be disseminated widely in China. And they ended up selling like hotcakes. They became, I think, the largest like medical device seller in China after doing this. But it was a very different form factor than their US machines that at that time would be pushed around like on a rolling cart and were about 5 feet high. These new machines that they made looked like laptops. They were much tinier. So they're smaller, cheaper, could be easier to adopt. And then because they had created that relatively higher performance for the price, it actually opened up new global markets that they hadn't anticipated with consumers that would not have typically adopted an ultrasound machine. So, like rural health clinics or ambulances. And so, what's so brilliant about that is that GE did not cannibalize their existing high cost product segment. Instead, they opened up this whole new segment of consumers that they could sell these new lower cost machines to.
So then, in my thinking about this, then leaders really need to ask themselves, are we solving a real problem for real people at scale, or are we optimizing for short-term financial metrics in a way that ignores systematic consequences? Because in your view, the most resilient and profitable enterprises will be those that explicitly factor in those humanitarian impacts into their innovation criteria and then build robust economic models around that impact instead of trying to retrofit them later.
I think it all depends, Charles. And it all depends on the product. Is Coca-Cola making a big humanitarian impact? I don't think so. Do they sell a lot of sugar water? Hell yeah. Right. And because it's appealing everywhere and it's at this price point and it's the most brilliant business model ever. Did the Honda Super Cub make a big humanitarian impact? I don't know. You could maybe make the case because it made the populace more mobile, right? And they could do more jobs and stuff like that. So, but it's more indirect than something like an ultrasound machine that like literally saves people's lives, right? So I think it all depends on your business. And I want to be clear that this book, Global by Design, is not this like tree hugger manifesto at all. We try to come at it very pragmatically. So there are going to be business cases that are just business for business sake. You see something that people want and you can sell it. And so the iPhone's a great example. That's really a global product because they don't have to change it at all. And everybody wants it because it's easy to use and really functional, but also a status symbol. So there's going to be those classes of products that is just good products that people want. There's also going to be classes of products that, like the ultrasound machine, that make a very clear and positive humanitarian impact while being a viable business model. And I certainly do work in that space too. Like our work on irrigation, I think falls into that. There's such a huge demand for improved irrigation technology, but at its core, farmers are only going to buy it if they make money from it. It's a pure free market driven model, even though governments help subsidize it, but the value is because farmers get value out of it. And then there's going to be other classes of products that you just do because you should and society should. And so, one example of that from my work are prosthetic feet. So the free market for prosthetic feet in poor countries doesn't exist. Like there's so many charities in the space that free market businesses couldn't compete because families know they can get a prosthetic limb for free. Why would they pay for one out of pocket? And particularly if you're talking about resource constrained countries and families in particular who have a disabled family member tend to be even more resource constrained. So that all perpetuates this like, why buy it? We'll get it for free. And so I've done a number of projects in that space, and we have to understand, okay, even though it's not a free market, it is still a market, right? There is something sustaining it, even if it's driven by charity. So we have to understand price points and functionality people need. And we've been able to make better mousetraps there as well. One is the leverage freedom chair, which I talk about in the book. And we're at the very last stages of commercializing a new prosthetic foot that's made of plastic and foam and rubber, but can outperform as well or better than carbon fiber feet that cost an order of magnitude more in terms of sales price. So we've been able to totally shift this price per performance point to provide high value, high performance for low resource consumers.
Great examples. Well, if a leader listening to our conversation today wants to start applying global by design, that mindset tomorrow, what would you tell them to do first?
So I'll do a few things first. If you're already in an existing company, you're good at stuff. You're selling stuff already. You work in a certain market segment. I would first do some benchmarking to look across markets and see what's similar, because it will give you It will give you a great insight on competitors. Are there people already selling a product like yours in an emerging market? And what is different about your product that could be better, that could disrupt it? Or how low would you have to go in price to really be a competitor? So that first process is that scoping activity. The next is coming back to this idea of broadening your perspective that we talked about before. And that's something that I do right from the get-go. And if you're talking about an international market, I'd start sending people there. I'd start having, it's actually relatively really low cost to just send a person there to go talk to, kiosks and retailers and go look at how people are using products and talk to some users about how much are they paying. And it's doing that kind of baseline ethnographic work that can really inform you about specific needs and requirements and desires of that market. And then I would do some forecasting. And all of this, by the way, is really cheap that I've said. You haven't spent any money on like physical infrastructure or anything yet. And so you can start doing some economic analyses to say, oh, the tractor I make in the US, it's actually going to be way too expensive. If we import it into India, do we have to tweak it a little bit? And because you did that ethnographic research, you're going to understand there's actually some hard requirements you're going to have to hit in order to be successful. And so then you can do this scoping activity internally to understand like what would, in quotes, better actually entail. And are you actually equipped to do it? And why this is so powerful too, is it also helps companies avoid this classic folly of saying, oh, our product's great in the US, it's going to be great everywhere. No, because it actively makes you understand, even though you may want to sell tractors in the US and in India, and even though they both have four wheels, the feature set and the use cases are probably going to be a bit different. And so the products are going to have to be a bit different, right? Even though you call them both tractors. So that is such an important exercise. And it's this like little subtlety that catches companies. I see it catch companies off guard all the time because they're like, we're already good at making this thing. And I'm like, yeah, even though you call that thing by the same name in this new market, it's actually a little bit different thing, right? So then you get a lot of clarity at that point. If you really know your requirements, if you're confident your company can actually satisfy them, you may also spot where you need to innovate as well. Then you're well equipped to actually take on that innovation activity. And what I think is so important there for companies at that point to do is to really understand what resources do they need to execute that innovation activity. Do they have enough in-house already? A situation I see all the time is companies that are great at making things may not have a big R&D division. They've been mostly focused on production, not innovation. And so you may want to bring in some outside folks. You may want to hire up some new folks and build a team internally. But the exercise of like knowing your requirements, knowing what you have to make also then translates over to what do I need to do it? And so then you can put together the right team and the right resources to actually execute that innovation. And then we talk about in the book as well, testing and validating new designs. And those are two different things. You can test to make sure things work as you anticipate. Like you were saying earlier on the lab bench, is it the efficiency that you thought? But then when you validate it, that's a whole new can of worms because you're talking about taking it into the real world and really testing a solution against all the requirements, which are the secondary requirements too, about like price and usability and aesthetics and, all these weird things, some of which you may not have considered. And we talk a lot in the book too about making sure you test early and often and not catastrophically, because the worst thing you can do is launch this wonderful new product and have it be a flop after you've done so much investment. Instead, if you can take more like baby steps and grow your confidence and reduce risk every step, that's a much more prudent process.
Well, thank you, Amos, for joining me and for giving us such a practical look at what global innovation actually requires.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you, learn more about your work, and talk to me a little bit more about your consultancy that you just developed.
Sure. So over my career, I've seen that there's resources that companies really need to tackle these global by design product development challenges. And so we're able to do that in the Cayley Cian Global Engineering Research Center, and we go by Gear Center. When problems are so difficult, we actually have to create knowledge and really innovate from the ground up. And so you can go to gear.mit.edu, and that has our whole research program. And we work with lots of companies to create disruptive new technologies, some of which I've talked about on this podcast, like the drip emitters with Toro. That was all a research project. Now, I've also seen that companies often struggle with how to plan out their innovation strategy, how to put together the right team of people, how to inculcate a culture of innovation in the company. And so they benefit from an outside consultant to help them do that. And also, I've seen a lot of companies and had them tell me directly, when we don't need to do a research project, sometimes we just need to do an applied engineering project or applied product design project. We'd love to have that resource. So with the launch of this book, I've also launched this new engineering consultancy called WinterWorks Consulting. And the website is winterworksconsulting.com. And it's to be able to provide these applied engineering and innovation and product design capabilities to companies around the world. So my hope now is that we actually have this full suite of capabilities that you want to do really ground up disruptive innovation, leveraging research. We can do it through Gear Center. You want to do applied engineering or innovation strategy? We can do it through WinterWorks.
Love that. Thank you so much again, Amos, for joining me. One idea I'm taking away from this conversation is that constraint is not simply something innovators have to overcome. Used well, it can become a design advantage. It forces sharper choices about what customers truly value, what a product really needs to do, and how to create more impact with fewer resources. Don't forget about their new book, Global by Design, How to Create Innovations at Scale, Travel, and Transform. Until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Remember, great ideas only matter when they change what you do next. So choose one insight from today's conversation and put it into practice this week. If this episode was valuable, follow the show and share it with someone who would benefit. And until next time, remember, the edge belongs to those who outlearned what worked yesterday, who can outthink what's coming next so that they can outperform when it counts.